succession or competitions of succession taking place across the region today. Now, who then are the players? Who are the key players and groups of players in this contest? I'm going to now consider three state-led alliances, and they will be the alliance led by Iran, the alliance led by Turkey, and the collection of Western aligned states, of which Israel finds itself one of the stronger parts. First of all, let me consider the Iran-led regional alliance. The alliance led by Iran, Islamic Republic of Iran, is without a doubt the most cohesive of the alliances we will consider in this talk. I don't say it's the strongest. It has many vulnerabilities, it has many weaknesses, but it is the most well held together and crystallized of the alliances. Who do we consider as members of it? Iran itself, obviously, the Assad regime in Syria, the Shia militia power, the Hashd al-Sha'bi power in Iraq, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis or Ansar Allah movement in Yemen, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and a number of smaller insurgent movements across the region. Why is this alliance so cohesive and well held together? Because Iran has, in the organizational shape of the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, an organization whose specific purpose is the aligning with movements and countries outside of the borders of Iran for them to serve the purpose of assisting the Iranian push for hegemony in the region. And it is as a result of the activities of the Revolutionary Guards Corps that Iran has done so very well across the ruined landscape of the Middle East over the last decade. Let's consider this point for a moment. The Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps is a unique organization. It's not an intelligence organization, though it functions like one sometimes. It's not a military organization, though it can perform those functions too. But it is an organization committed to the advancement of the Islamic Republic of Iran via the use of proxy political and military organizations. Now, in normal times, a possession of such an organization by a state might not have meant very much. But in a situation like the one which I described at the beginning, where state authority has collapsed across broad swathes of the Arab world, the possession by a state of a movement, or an organization rather, whose specific task is the raising up and managing of proxy political and military forces, will be worth its weight in gold to the state that possesses such an organization. And Iran is the only regional state that does. And if we think about Iran's success in Yemen, Iran's success in Lebanon, Iran's success in Syria, and Iran's success in Iraq, we can trace all this, and we can deal with this in more detail during question. We can trace all this back to the skill set of the Revolutionary Guards Corps and its external force, the Quds, the famous Quds force of the late Major General Qasem Soleimani. Thus far with regard to the Iranian-led regional alliance. Second alliance I'd like to consider, the alliance led by Republic of Turkey, and consisting of Turkey itself, obviously, I would say the Emirate of Qatar also, the what's called the National Salvation Government, or the government of Libya, located in Tripoli, the government of Mr. Fayez Sarraj, which only rules, of course, around half of Libya, but it's the internationally recognized government of Libya. And I would also include in this alliance the Hamas organization, which, of course, is today de facto the sovereign in the Gaza Strip area. So this is a smaller alliance than that of the Iranians. And it is, as you will already have gathered from the list that I've just run through, in essence, it is the alliance of Sunni political Islam. That is to say, if we think of the alliance of the Iranians as being, to a great extent, an alliance of Shia political Islamists, this is the alliance of Sunni political Islam. Now, it's, of course, a relatively short list of countries. It's worth remembering that just about 10 years ago, we were thinking that this was going to be a much bigger list. That's to say, there was a moment in about 2011, 2012, when Israel was looking down the barrel of the potential disaster in which Egypt was in the hands of, if you remember, Mohammed Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood. in which Syria looked like it was about to fall to an Islamist rebel uprising, and in which therefore Israel would have been looking down the barrel of a situation of being surrounded by new, hungry, Sunni Islamist regimes. That didn't happen, of course. The old order in the region proved rather stronger than the Muslim Brothers. The Muslim Brothers proved rather incompetent when it came to administration rather than political agitation. And as a result, in both Egypt and Syria, and indeed also in Tunisia, they failed and they were removed from government, or in the Syrian case, never reached government. But there remains, nevertheless, a powerful state-led alliance gathered around the regime of President Erdogan, government, if you prefer, of President Erdogan in Turkey. Now, let me pause here for a moment to draw what I think is a fascinating and important commonality between these two alliances. They're quite similar. The current regime in Iran and the current government in Turkey are quite similar in the following way. Both Turkey and Iran are post-imperial countries. Yeah, they are both states that arose on the ruins of historic empires of long standing, the Persian Empire and of course the Ottoman Empire in the Turkish case. And both of these regimes rule in the name of political Islam, not in the name of, ostensibly at least, the nationalism of the particular country of which they are a part. But they represent therefore an interesting combination of post-imperial ambition, states that were empires, that therefore have a very large sense of their own natural place, and therefore a very large sense of ambition, having fallen from that natural place, combined with the energies of political Islam. It's a particularly potent mix, I would say, in both cases, and it's something worth considering. Now, with regard to the third alliance, which I wanted to talk about, this is what one might call the status quo alliance, of largely consisting of countries traditionally aligned with the West and with the United States, who are now in an increasingly crystallized way coming together in order to meet, very overtly and consciously, in order to meet the challenges represented by both the Iranian and the Turkish regional projects. Now, who would we consider as members of this alliance? I mentioned that Israel is clearly a member, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, the Republic of Egypt, I would say also the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, and plus some other lesser players, perhaps the Kurdish regional government in northern Iraq, arguably also the Palestinian Authority of Mahmoud Abbas, and a number of smaller players. But these are the key members of that alliance. Now, if I'd been giving this talk a year and a half ago, I would have said that this is very much a tacit alliance rather than an overt one, because it consists among it, of countries of vastly different forms of political organization, ranging from democracy across to absolute monarchy, with a number of variants in between. But since, I would say, the conclusion of the Abraham Accords between Israel and, most importantly, United Arab Emirates, I think it's possible now to see a greater crystallization of this alliance, a growing sense in which Israel, Egypt, United Arab Emirates, and I would say also Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, even though Israel doesn't yet have, of course, formal diplomatic relations with it, have a clear sense of common analysis of the region, of common enemies, of common outlook, and of common, and consequently of common and shared interests. So I think this is an additional emergent alliance coming together in our region. And I think this is not only to speak in sort of highfalutin terms about alliances. If we think about how this works on the ground, look at the cooperation today on the security level between Israel and the Republic of Egypt. At no time since the peace treaty of 1979 has there been a higher level of cooperation between Israel and Egypt as there is at the present time. And the reason is because of the good and unifying matter of shared enemies. As a result of the presence of a powerful and active franchise of the Islamic State organization in Sinai, which the Egyptian army has had real trouble getting a handle on over the last half decade or so. Egypt has requested and has received very considerable assistance from Israel, not only on the intelligence level, but also the active engagement of Israeli air power in support of Egyptian ground forces against that Wilayat Sinai, it's called, Sinai province of the Islamic State. So this is an alliance which has practical implications. If we think also of the way that Egypt and United Arab Emirates supported the cause of General Haftar in Libya against the Turkish-supported government of Fayez Sarraj in Tripoli in the course of the last 4 or 5 years, then again we have a concrete example of the way that these countries work together. And if we think just yesterday of a very important signing of a large-scale defense deal between Israel and Greece in the Eastern Mediterranean, directed in this fairly overtly against the Turkish interest. Important to note that a senior official of United Arab Emirates was present at that signing. So again, this is a very, very practical set of arrangements, countries coming together because of the possession of shared enemies. Thus far then, with regard to what I would consider to be the 3 main active blocks competing with one another over the ruins of the fallen Arab order. Let me just say, Steve mentioned at the beginning, I wrote a book called Days of the Fall. I did, and it was about the Syria and Iraq wars. And the fall I was referring to was what I consider, and others consider at least, to have been the fall of the Middle East political order in the last decade as a result of the fragmentation and collapse of a number of Arab states. Thus far then, with regard to the 3 alliances, I should mention just in a sentence that we should note a 4th, much less consequential but notable power in the region, and that is the Salafi jihadi networks of activity in the region, Al-Qaeda network, and of course the Islamic State network. These do not control territory, but they are notable political players and military players in a number of spaces nevertheless. Now, what I'd like to go on now to consider is the role of international actors in this on this Middle Eastern stage. Firstly, we'll consider the role of the United States. The United States, as is well known, engaged in 2 very costly and unsuccessful interventions into the Middle East, broadly defined in the course of the last 2 decades. And those, of course, were the invasion of Afghanistan and then the invasion of Iraq. The United States, as I don't need to inform anybody here, is currently a society deeply troubled and engaged in an important internal discussion about its nature as a society. The United States is a country which has been a global hegemon for the last 20 years and which is now adjusting to face, for the first time, a real challenge to its hegemony, coming, of course, from the People's Republic of China. For all these reasons combined, there is today in America very little energy for major intervention or major engagement in the Middle East. America is, as we now know, leaving Afghanistan by September 11th, 2021. America has 2,500 troops left in Iraq, but it's looking for ways to honorably remove them too. And America is, of course, the main Middle East activity of the United States as we speak, is the nuclear negotiation with Iran taking place in Vienna, the purpose of which very clearly is to conclude as rapidly as possible something resembling a return to the JCPOA of 2015 in order to enable the United States not to deal with the Middle East and to turn its attentions elsewhere. So the United States, having been for the last 2 decades the hegemonic power of our region, is today very consequentially looking to withdraw from the Middle East. And as it does so, it's leaving in its wake some degree of vacuum which other powers are seeking to fill. This, by the way, is not a trend which is the invention of this or that president. This is a national strategy on the part of the US, or at least practiced as a national strategy on the part of the US, that has continued throughout the last 3 presidencies. That's to say, Obama pursued something along these lines, Trump pursued something along these lines, and Biden is continuing that general trend of America seeking to draw down in the Middle East from the very major commitments of 2 decades ago. some degree of vacuum is being left. I want to consider the role of two other players. First of these is Russia. Russia, of course, is a country with an economy the size of a middling EU country. It doesn't have the wherewithal to be a superpower, but it does have a very, very capable leadership, a very, very capable leader, President Vladimir Putin, who's very good at playing a poor hand very well. In the Middle East, Russia is back. It's on the ground in Syria. The Russians saved their Assad regime client in 2015 when he was on the verge of falling. The Russians aren't going home anytime soon. They have a major air base in Khmeimim in Latakia province, a major naval base on the Mediterranean coast of Tartus, which brings the Russian fleet into the Mediterranean Sea for the first time. It's the only base the Russians possess outside of the former Soviet Union, naval base, I mean. So the Russians have returned to the region as a result of their activity with Assad, and they're here to stay. What are the Russians doing in the region? They are trying to make themselves indispensable, and they're doing a pretty good job of it. And Russia would like to see a situation where if you want to get anything done in the region, you have to go through Moscow. I'll give you an example. If you're Israel and you want to bomb the Iranians in Syria to prevent an Iranian military infrastructure from being constructed all the way to the Quneitra crossing, you'll need Russian permission to do so because Russian anti-aircraft systems are deployed throughout Syria. And Israel has that Russian permission, but that makes Russia indispensable with regard to Israel's considerations. And the same with regard to the Eastern Mediterranean. And the other aspect of what Russia is trying to do is it's trying to sell arms, and lots of them, to as many people as possible who want to buy. And there are buyers in Egypt, in Saudi Arabia, of course in Syria, and beyond. So Russia, limited ambitions, pursued very, very shrewdly and often very, very effectively. The third and final player with regard to external forces is the one about which it's possible to say the least at the present time, even though it's very consequential. That country, of course, is China. And the reason why it's not possible to draw any firm conclusions about the Chinese strategy in the Middle East is because the Chinese themselves, I don't think, have fully formulated it. China is aware it's moving towards global power status, but China doesn't quite know what it wants out of the Middle East yet. I speak to the Chinese embassy here in Tel Aviv quite regularly, and I can tell you my sense is that what the Chinese value above all else is order. They want to deal with stable states. They don't want to worry about investing in a state and then losing their investment because the state collapses a year later. They're quite willing, and they're big enough to trade with and deal with states which are themselves opposed to one another. And this is notable, for example, that the Chinese on March 27th announced a 25-year strategic agreement with Iran, which is supposed to lead to an investment by China of $400 billion into Iran over the next 25 years. And people are very concerned about that, and justifiably so, because they're saying, well, does that mean that China is picking Iran as its strategic ally in the region? But we should note the tremendously broad volume of trade between Iran and the countries of the Gulf Cooperation Council, let's say Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Oman, and the others. The volume of trade, I think, reaches something like $160 billion. China is the major purchaser of petrochemical products from the GCC countries. China also has a pretty healthy trade relationship, smaller of course, but healthy, with Israel. So there's a sense in which China is moving in, but as to exactly how China is going to align itself strategically, it's currently, I would say, too soon to draw any really firm conclusions in that regard. Finally, I want to just give a bit of a news update and say what are the key events taking place within the broad structure I've tried to describe over the last half an hour, which are currently taking place, which we should kind of be keeping our eyes on. Well, I've already mentioned the China deal with Iran, which I think is something which we all should be carefully considering. What's China up to? What are the consequences of it likely to be? You may well have seen in the, if you follow Middle East news websites, that there's been news in recent days of negotiations between Iran and Saudi Arabia, an attempt to bring together those two parties in conflict. in Arabic media today, there's a number of reports suggesting that it is China that stands behind that effort, and that this was in fact a Chinese condition to Iran for the conclusion of the strategic agreement of March 27th that I mentioned a moment ago. So this tells us also something about China, that China seeks order. China wants to deal with everyone, and it also wants, insofar as it can, to mediate and to become a diplomatically important factor in the region. So that's one thing I think to bear in mind. Secondly, we mentioned the negotiations in Vienna. I can only reiterate what I already said, which is that what I think it's clear this is about, it's about, frankly, the Americans essentially trying to just get back to the JCPOA, which Trump, of course, left in 2018, as quickly as possible. That's from the American point of view. From the Israeli point of view, that's worrying indeed, of course, because it means that Israel, unlike in the situation over most of the last half decade, simply doesn't have a partner anymore in Washington for its own project, which is the attempt to try to hold back and roll back the Iranian push for regional hegemony. That's the way it looks like in Jerusalem, what the Iranians are trying to do. And I think it is what the Iranians are trying to do. But the current American team, people like Robert Malley, of course, managing the negotiations in Vienna, simply don't see it in those terms. And this is worrying, especially when we consider that Israel is, to all intents and purposes, engaged in a shadow war against Iran at the present time, across the region, in the air, on land, in cyberspace, and as we know, also now, also on the seas. And Israel is engaged in that fight and regards that fight as probably its key strategic challenge at the present time. And it is increasingly coming to the conclusion that the United States is not on the same page in that regard. And this is something I think very, very important to know. A third point in this regard, in regional news headlines in the last 48 hours, is a decision by Russia to escort Iranian ships on their way to Syria to deliver oil and wheat to the Assad regime in Syria. This is very important because, of course, those ships have been vulnerable to Israeli attempts to damage them in the course of the last 2 or 3 years. And this is an important and interesting decision by Russia to say something like the following: look, Iran is breaking international sanctions by bringing oil to Syria. Russia doesn't, Russia don't care, and we're going to help them do it. This is something, again, which Israel, I think, should be paying, and no doubt is paying, very close attention to. An additional current set of issues underway is with regard to Iraq. Just yesterday, there was a rocket attack on a US, or on a base, Al-Balad air base, where US personnel and F-16 aircraft are present. 5 rockets were launched at the base. And this is the second such attack in the course of the last 5 days, literally in the last week. And the tempo of attacks on American positions in Iraq has been going up. There's been 20 such attacks since January, since the inauguration of President Joe Biden. Who's carrying out these attacks? It is the Iranians carrying out these attacks via their proxy Shia militias in Iraq. And there's a strong sense that the Iranians appear to have the view that that the United States can be expelled from Iraq in the period now ahead, and that this would look like and could be presented as a very major victory from the Iranian point of view, and that then the Iranians can push forward with what I like to call the Lebanonization of Iraq. That is to say, the drawing of Iraq under Iranian influence in the more or less total way that Lebanon currently finds itself. I think the Iranians have looked at the Biden's decision on Afghanistan. They've looked at his general desire to draw down in the region, and they, I think, are trying to bring about a withdrawal under fire of the United States from Iraq. And this is something I think closely to watch and to bear in mind. To move towards conclusion, then, just a couple of final points. To reiterate, we are currently in the midst of a moment of profound importance to our region, in which the Arab world, to a great extent, has collapsed and transformed. From an Israeli point of view, the rise of Iran and the rise of Turkey and the Turkish challenge are of course matters of deep concern. But they also bring with them very profound opportunities from an Israeli point of view. And if we think about the Abraham Accords, and we think about the closeness now between Israel and the United Arab Emirates, and if we think also of the very clear commonalities between Israel and the current de facto leadership in Saudi Arabia, namely, of course, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and those around him, then we find ourselves in a world, the contours of which would literally have been difficult to imagine just 2 decades or a decade and a half ago. Because this is a situation in which Israel finds itself effectively in alliance with the core states of the Arab world, with whom it was once in bitter conflict. That is to say, Israel in alliance with Egypt, de facto alliance with Saudi Arabia, and of course, very close friendship with the United Arab Emirates. And it finds itself in that alliance, part of an alliance, which is directed against the ambitions of the other 2 non-Arab states in the region, as we mentioned, Iran and Turkey. This is a more or less complete reversal to the strategic situation Israel found itself in half a century ago, in the 50s and 60s, if people remember, where there was efforts underway by Ben-Gurion, then David Ben-Gurion, for an alliance of peripheries, in which Israel would seek to align with Iran under the Shahs then, of course, and align with Turkey under Kemalist government then, against the challenge of the Arab encirclement of Israel. In this respect, the strategic situation facing Israel has more or less come full circle. And that's a fascinating, I think, trend and a fascinating process to note and to engage in. I'll conclude just by saying, I haven't spent time engaging you or boring you with anecdotes from my own work on the ground in the Middle East over the last decade and a half. But let me just say that these strategic processes I'm discussing, which I regard not only as strategic processes, but also as historic processes, have been ones that myself and my colleagues, have been watching from very, very close up over the last decade and a half, from Damascus, from Baghdad, from Beirut, from Ankara, and so on and so forth. And this is something which I wish to say and to conclude by saying, it's something which is not only about cold strategic logic, but it is also about the transformation of societies, and as a result, also about the transformation of the lives, for better and often, I'm afraid, for worse, of millions of people of many nationalities across the Middle East. So on that note, I'll be happy to conclude this initial talk. And I think we have 15, 20 minutes or so left for questions, which I'll now be very happy to try to engage with. Thanks.
Okay, Jonathan, thank you. That was a very strategic and pinpointed overview of some crucial Middle Eastern issues. There's lots of differences of opinion on many things in the Middle East, but I'm sure one thing we can all agree on is that there's never a dull moment in the region. So we've got a few questions here, but before I get to those, I just wanted to touch on the Abraham Accords, because that is something that, for a lot of Israel supporters, it's been very heartwarming to see the UAE, Bahrain, Sudan, Morocco, albeit they have it's not without ulterior motives and whatnot, but they've normalized relations with Israel. What do you see happening with the Accords now that the Trump administration is over? Biden has come in. He's already started reversing some of the the things that Trump implemented. So just briefly, where do you see the Accords going? Do you see some other states coming next, or do you think it will just come to a standstill?
Well, the next step, which we're all thinking about, of course, Steve, would be Saudi Arabia. I think it's going to take a while with regard to that. I think that's very significant. The distancing by the Biden administration from MBS, from Mohammed bin Salman, is very significant, and it will remain to be seen if his fortunes remain in the ascendant as they have been over the last decade or so. With regard to Saudi Arabia, in general, I think the most important. I think we can all agree, really, the most important of the Abraham Accords, the most important component is, of course, the conclusion of peace, of diplomatic, or establishment of diplomatic relations with the United Arab Emirates.
Yeah.
And I think that it would be difficult to exaggerate the extent to which the regional analysis of Mohammed bin Zayed of Abu Dhabi and the regional analysis of the Kiryat in Tel Aviv and of the Prime Minister's office in Jerusalem align. They really do align on all the key elements with regard to the Iranian challenge, with regard to the challenge of Sunni political Islam, with regard to the nature of Turkish ambitions. It would be difficult to exaggerate the extent to which Israel and UAE are on the same page. And to be honest with you, I think, frankly, the sense that the US administration currently is not really on the same page will be likely to only deepen the connection between UAE and Israel, because there's a sense now in which the UAE will need Israel all the more, because it won't be able to rely on the Americans in the way perhaps it thought it could a year or two or three ago. So in a certain odd sense, I think that the realignment taking place under Biden will actually stand to strengthen the core component of the Abraham Accords, which with all great respect to Bahrain and to Sudan, is the relationship between Israel and the UAE. So I think in that respect, there's cause for optimism here.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks for that. We have some great questions here, so I'm just making sure that I get to the beginning. So here's one. How will the possible rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran affect Israel?
Yeah, my own sense is that there won't be a really profound rapprochement. There are contacts and there are talks, and it's significant. As we're hearing now, it comes about as a result of Chinese efforts. That's important because it means that the Chinese are now clearly becoming a diplomatic player in the region. And that will be important for Israel and for all others. But whether we think that there is going to be a real and historic rapprochement between the Islamic Republic of Iran and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, I can't see it, because it is the nature of the regime in Tehran that it wishes to supplant Saudi Arabia. It wishes to emerge as the key and hegemonic power in the Persian Gulf, including over the other side of the Persian Gulf, where, of course, Saudi Arabia and the smaller Arab Emirates are located. And this is a hard strategic fact, which I think the Saudis are keenly aware of. And, they can't help but be made aware of it when they're having rockets and missiles fired at them on a more or less weekly basis from Yemen, and also to some extent from Iraq, under Iranian auspices. These are all core, strategic components of what the Iranian regional project is all about. So the fact that there's talks is certainly interesting, but I don't think we should be rushing ahead to assume that there's going to be a real and historic rapprochement, because frankly, I can't quite see what such a rapprochement would look like, unless one or other of those states is going to simply utterly transform its former stance. And there's precious little evidence that that's likely or even possible.
Okay, all right, very good, thank you. Another question here, why is, you touched briefly on Turkey, why is Turkey allowed to still be a member of NATO?
Well, that's a very good question, which I'm afraid I often ask myself, and I find it hard to know the answer. Well, defenders of that fact, of Turkey's still firm and secure membership of NATO, they would say the following. They would say, Turkey was NATO's key southern flank against the Soviet Union during the Cold War, and such an argument would say that there is currently a rising Russian state with worrying ambitions of its own, and therefore we need to do all we can to keep Turkey on side, in spite of the problematic nature of the current Turkish government. I don't share that view, but that's the view that defenders of Turkey's continued membership in NATO would take. The reason I don't share it, I think uncontroversially, is because the nature of the current regime in Turkey, in my view at least, is such that Turkey doesn't really want to be an ally of the West anymore, doesn't want to play that role. Turkey wants to play the role of the key rising state in the Middle East, including, by the way, as part of that, in challenging the interests of other Western states, of Israel, of Greece, perhaps of Saudi Arabia also. So Turkey's not cut out for that role. But I think what really is happening is that institutional knowledge in NATO, and perhaps in Western capitals as a whole, is still catching up with the reality of what Erdogan's Turkey actually is and of what Erdogan's Turkey actually wants. And when that knowledge does catch up, I would think, or may I say, I would hope, the matter of Turkey's continued membership of NATO will then come to be called into question.
Right, right, okay. Well, thank you. So a question here, and I fully sort of agree that there's definitely left with the impression here. Why are Europe and the US so keen to have an agreement with Iran?
Well, look, with regard to the Biden administration, I can only go back to what I said before, which is that I think the Biden administration wants out of the Middle East. They want to minimize the American footprint in the Middle East. And they think that the way they can do that is by normalizing the situation between Iran and its neighbors and between Iran and the West. And from their point of view, one of the key components of that was the JCPOA. They believed, at least, that by signing the JCPOA, they normalized Iran's relations with the international community vis-a-vis its nuclear program, and they therefore sort of paved the way for turning Islamic Republic of Iran into a normal regional and international actor. That's why I think the proponents of JCPOA believed the Biden administration is those people. Often it's exactly the same people, by the way, and that was always a view more or less shared in European capitals. A little bit less in France. The French were more and remain more skeptical, but more or less shared in Berlin, in London, and in Paris. Again, why do they want it? That's, I think, why they want it. I don't share, of course, that view for the simple reason, again, that I think Islamic Republic of Iran is not a candidate for becoming a normal state, because its regime doesn't want to be a normal state. Its regime, once again, wants to emerge as the key power in the region. And therefore, any nuclear agreement that's open-ended and has an end date, and that does not include, aggressive inspections of military sites as well as civilian sites and all those other safeguards, an agreement, of course, which Iran would never sign. Any agreement that doesn't contain elements such as those will be an agreement that will simply be allow Iran to mark time whilst it continues to push towards becoming a nuclear threshold state, as I have no doubt it wishes to become.
Okay, a worrying prospect. Another question here, quite a short one, very to the point. Why does Qatar support Hamas?
Qatar's support for Hamas follows a broader pattern of Qatari behavior in the region. Qatar, for the last 25 years now, since the mid-1990s, has elected to align itself with Sunni political Islamic movements, and specifically with Muslim Brotherhood movements. It gave shelter to Muslim Brotherhood exiles from across the region, the famous preacher Yusuf al-Qaradawi being one of the most prominent among them, but Hamas leaders also, Mash'al and others, now Haniya also, all maintain homes in Doha. So the support for Hamas is part of a broader pattern of support for Sunni political Islam. Why does Qatar support the Muslim Brotherhood in the way that it does? Well, I mean, you could argue, and I think it's a pretty good argument, that Qatar has managed to punch way above its weight in regional diplomacy over the last quarter of a century, precisely via this support. Qatar has been willing to offer support and to magnify the voices of powerful revolutionary Islamist movements and forces in a number of countries, Egypt and Syria, obviously among the Palestinians and elsewhere. And it's done that And through so doing, it has acquired for itself, if I can put it this way, a place at the top table of regional diplomacy, and it's become an indispensable country in that regard by first of all stirring up trouble and then proposing itself as the solution. We can be annoyed about it, of course, because it's in many ways, one could argue it's a kind of nihilistic approach to diplomacy in which a quite insignificant country or a gas station with a capital city, you could also say, if you want to be unkind about it, has managed to make itself very important by stirring up trouble. Having said all that, of course, because not to be totally negative about it, having said all that, of course, Israel today, frankly, relies on Qatar's, on the offices, good offices, you can say if you want, of Qatar, to maintain its relations with the de facto Hamas state in Gaza. And frankly, the situation today vis-a-vis Gaza is that Israel allows Hamas to rule, and it allows Qatar to prop up that rule financially in return for Hamas not throwing rockets at Israeli towns and cities. Now, you can argue that's not a very good state of affairs, but you can also, I think, make the fairly cogent case that there isn't really a better state of affairs on offer unless you want to send the army into Gaza City, destroy the Hamas regime, and reoccupy the entirety of the Gaza Strip. Now, some people do want that, but the great majority of the Israeli public don't. So oddly and interestingly, this is a way in which Qatar, through its practice of supporting the Muslim Brotherhood Hamas, plays, ostensibly at least, a relatively positive role.
That's well, thank you for that enlightenment. Another question here: would you say that Iran's ties with China are only limited compared to Beijing's engagement with other Middle Eastern countries such as Saudi and the UAE?
The answer is yes, I would say that. And that's in spite of the great sort of ringing declaration of a 25-year strategic agreement expecting investment of $400 billion between China and Iran. That sounds, enormous, of course. But the fact of the matter is that China has concluded Belt and Road Initiative papers or agreements with all the states of the Gulf Cooperation Council, including the ones that you just mentioned, Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates. And the simple fact of the matter is that China's potential connections and existing connections to Saudi Arabia and to UAE outweigh anything that's really conceivable with Iran, because what does Iran have to offer China? What will Iran be offering when compared to the facilities available and the resources of the Gulf states? Very, very limited. They can offer cheap oil. They can maybe offer some maritime positions for the Chinese military, but beyond that, not a great deal. And by the way, it's worth noting, and I think it's an important point to note that hasn't been sufficiently covered in coverage of this matter, hasn't been written about sufficiently in coverage of this matter, which is that there is great domestic opposition in Iran also for allowing Iranian soil to be used for the bases of foreign military. There's something of a taboo for the Iranians in this regard. It goes, by the way, with regard to their relations with Russia, and it will also include their relations with China. So yeah, I do think so. I think this is a more limited relationship by its very nature, because of the limited capacity of Iran to offer China all that much than it might initially have looked. And I think especially when we consider the extensive and deep and mutually beneficial relations between China and the Arab Gulf states. China is the single largest consumer today of petrochemical products from the Gulf Arabs. That's not going to change. As we know, China has an enormous population. It's short of natural resources. It needs oil and gas. And for the most part, it's going to be getting those from the Arab states of the Gulf. It will get them from Iran too, but it will continue to get them from the Arab states of the Gulf.
Okay, thanks for answering that. I have another one here. Is the peace process between Israel and the Palestinians between Israel and Palestine an obstacle or gateway to tackling Iran?
I think that Frank, to be honest with you, I think that it's neither. I think it's, I'm not quite convinced there is a peace process today between Israel and Palestine. I think what there is there are a set of de facto arrangements between Israel and the two Palestinian entities which exist west of the Jordan River. Obviously, we've discussed already briefly the Hamas enclave in Gaza. And there is also, of course, the Palestinian National Authority of Mahmoud Abbas and Fatah in the West Bank. Now, Israel has de facto relations with both. Israel de facto actually accepts the continued existence of both. That's perhaps controversial to say about Gaza. I've already explained, I think, why it is the case. With regard to the Palestinian Authority, Israel continues to underwrite its existence by the process of security cooperation. Mahmoud Abbas, with his Western-trained security forces, continues to cooperate with Israel and in a productive and effective way to jointly fight against the efforts of Islamist terror organizations to entrench themselves in the West Bank. The situation is fairly calm from a military or security point of view, and I think it's probably set to continue that way for the foreseeable future. But even if it doesn't, I think the sense that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or the Israeli-Palestinian peace process or issue lies at the center of regional strategic considerations, so that it's sort of set to play an immensely influential role regarding other major files, I think is not really there anymore. It's not as central as it was anymore. And this takes me back really to the first point I made here this evening, which was with regard to the collapse and eclipse of the Arab politics that we have known over the last half century. That Arab world of, stable, unsuccessful, repressive Arab states has largely collapsed. And with it, I think, has collapsed the world of assumptions that it worked under. And one of those was the centrality or supposed centrality of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to the entirety of the Middle East. And I think that assumption has largely gone. There are those who would like to revive it, but it has largely gone. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict, therefore, I would suggest, has been reduced to its actual dimensions, namely of one of very many ongoing, intractable border disputes between entities that emerged on the ruins of European colonialism. There are many of those, and I think Israel versus Palestine, so to speak, is one of them. And that's the way it's set to be. So I don't think it'll impact on Israel versus Iran one way or the other.
Okay. Can you say something about the reported contacts between Israel and the Assads?
Yeah, well, there have been reports of meetings between Israeli people representing the Israeli government, at least, not necessarily officials, and the Assad regime, mediated by the Russians and taking place, according to the reports, at the Khmeimim air base in Latakia province, which I mentioned before, which is the main Russian base in Syria. What I can say with some knowledge is that the contacts did take place and that they have continued. They are ongoing. It wasn't just the one meeting that was reported a couple of months ago. There are ongoing track 2, or so to speak, or track 1.5 contacts. The papers at least talked about former Chief of Staff Gadi Eisenkot as one of the people centrally involved in this. What's this all about? It's not about the peace process of the Golan Heights or any of that stuff. It's about the notion that some Israelis have that Russia and Assad could jointly be induced to oblige the Iranians to quit Syria in return for the normalization of the Assad regime in the eyes of the world and the subsequent beginning of the injection of international funds for the reconstruction of Syria. By the way, from what I understand, the United Arab Emirates is also very much part of this and believes in this possibility. I must say that from my own point of view, for what it's worth, I think those Israelis who believe that could happen are deluding themselves, because I don't think that Bashar al-Assad, not even sure if he could, but I'm fairly certain that he won't attempt to push the Iranians out of Syria. He's relied on them, he's been dependent on them for the survival of his regime. He may find them an uncomfortable partner in all kinds of ways, but I think when he looks at the graveyard of Arab dictators of the last 10 years, Gaddafi, Mubarak and others, he will no doubt be cognizant of the fact that it was his alliance with Iran, probably more than any other single factor, that prevented him from sharing the fate of those other dictators for better or for worse. And therefore, I think he'd be very, very unlikely to cede that. But having said that, there are Israelis who believe this is a worthwhile avenue to explore, and fair play to them for that, obviously. And at least as far as I'm aware, the Russian-mediated contacts between Israelis, not sure if it's Israel, but between Israelis who certainly report back to the government and the Assad regime, mediated by the Russians, are taking place, and I think are taking place on a continuous basis.
Okay. Okay, we've got another question here, if you're okay for time.
Sure.
You may have touched on this already, but do you think that China will take a significant leadership role in the region, or just pursue its search for resources?
I tend to think the latter. I realize there are others who don't see it that way anymore, and there's been even some quite, I would say, apocalyptic or alarmist writing, which says something like, there is now a crystallizing anti-Western alliance in the region. It's led by China, and it includes Russia, Iran, and Turkey. Now, that's the kind of stuff for which I guess op-eds are made. I mean, it sounds immensely simple, immensely frightening, you know, and immensely dangerous. Yeah, it's good for the drama. I'm not convinced that that's happening. I'm not convinced that the Chinese necessarily want to emerge as a key strategic actor in the region, in the sense that to do that, you have to make enemies as well. If you want to align with Iran, you will eventually make enemies of Israel and Saudi Arabia. If you want to align with Israel and Saudi Arabia, you will make enemies of Iran and of Assad and of perhaps of Iraq, or the emergent Iraq, and so on and so forth. Currently, at least when I speak to the Chinese guys engaged with this stuff, they don't want that. I think what they want, what they need, that's what they want. They need trade routes across the Middle East to get stuff to the Mediterranean. That's part of what the Belt and Road is all about. The land route of the Belt and Road that goes through the Middle East, and it has to. I think what the Chinese want as a framework of that is, above all else, stability. And I think they will be willing to dip a toe into the waters of Middle East diplomacy if they think they can do that through promotion of stability. If they can say, well, let's bring Iran and Saudi Arabia together and see if we can make Iraq a more stable place and make parts of the region more stable. But I think the Chinese are also aware of their own inabilities and absences of knowledge. Whenever I speak to them, I think they're, in a way, refreshingly aware that there's so much about the Middle East that they don't know. They're frightened, by the way, this comes up again and again, they're frightened in its very nature by political Islam. Political Islam confuses them, bewilders them, and terrifies them. And the impact of that is to make them not want to get too involved. So I think they know they're going to be a global power, which means engagement with the Middle East. But I don't believe that they have some sort of strategic master plan in which, you know, they have a strategy to replace America in the Middle East, and that strategy will involve aligning with other anti-Western forces to create a powerful anti-Western line. It may end up like that decades down the line, years down the line. I don't believe there's anything quite as overt and clear in Chinese thinking suggesting that at the present time. So the answer is, to answer your question, is yeah, I think they are mainly concerned with the Middle East with regard to their desperate need for cheap and available resources. That's the main reason.
Okay, try and make this the final one.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a possibility that the situation in Lebanon currently may affect Israel's interests?
Yeah, I think the situation in Lebanon does already affect Israel's interest in the following way. I think that Lebanese Hezbollah and its Iranian master, of course, have made what may well have been a strategic mistake by becoming what now any serious observer of Lebanon knows them to be, which is by becoming the de facto ruler of Lebanon. They've become the de facto ruler of Lebanon, and in so doing, they have driven away Saudi and Gulf money. They have therefore precipitated a profound economic crisis in Lebanon, in which Lebanon, since March of last year, is now for the first time in its history defaulting on its national debt, in a situation in which, when they go to look for a bailout from the IMF makes demands of them, which by its very nature, the Hezbollah-led system in Lebanon cannot satisfy. And as a result, their currency is collapsing. And there is a real possibility today of hunger, of a food crisis in Lebanon. So Hezbollah has turned, and Iran have turned Lebanon into a failed state. And that, I think, has important implications from an Israeli point of view. Because what it means is that Hezbollah today and its Iranian masters simply don't have the luxury of provoking Israel, provoking border incidents, engaging in provocations, as they would like to do against Israel, because they are currently desperately trying to keep Lebanon afloat and not necessarily making a particularly good job of it. So in this sense, we can say that it's a terrible, dreadful matter, of course, for the people of Lebanon. And there's no, in any way, animosity towards them. But frankly, keeping Hezbollah, keeping Nasrallah and co busy with avoiding disaster, economic and social and societal in their own country is advantageous for Israel, because all Israel really wants from them, of course, is not to bother Israel. So yes, undoubtedly, Lebanon's internal crisis is of profound importance to Israel, and from an Israeli point of view, it's generally a benefit.
Okay. Well, Jonathan, it's certainly been very insightful, and your perspectives are, very, very focused and spot on. So thank you for this fascinating insight. Yeah, thank you for answering as many of the questions as possible. It's been a pleasure on behalf of the WZO here in the UK and the ZF. We've really enjoyed hosting you. For everyone here, we will follow up tomorrow with a recording of the session in case you've had to, duck out and come back in or miss parts of it, or for those who haven't been able to attend but registered. Just a few things about events coming up. We have one on Tuesday next week, so that's Tuesday the 27th, which is another virtual online tour of Sipori, which is the ancient capital of the Galilee. So do join us. I'll put the details and the booking details in our follow-up email tomorrow. Plus, in early May, on Sunday, the 2nd of May, we've got another in our Inspirational Zionist series of webinars featuring, which focuses on Golda Meir. And then we have something else the following week about the Jews of Ethiopia and their exodus, their Red Sea exodus via Sudan. And we have a very fascinating chap who is going to present that. So again, on behalf of the World Zionist Organization here in the UK and the Zionist Federation, thank you to our guest speaker, Jonathan. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your insight. You provided a really valuable perspective on this tumultuous region. So thank you very much. And thank you to everyone for joining us. Keep safe, keep well. Enjoy the few freedoms that we've got, and please God, we'll have more in the weeks to come. And thank you everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.